Some acts of courage happen in silence, witnessed only by the winter wind and 3 faithful animals. In the brutal winter of 1893, deep in the Colorado Rockies, a reclusive trapper named Jericho Croft opened his cabin door to a sight that would haunt him forever. 3 half-frozen donkeys, alone and desperate, carrying a burden more precious than gold. What he discovered in their canvas packs would force him to make an impossible choice: stay safe in his mountain sanctuary, or risk everything to deliver a dying doctor's final gift to a town full of strangers. This is the story of one man's journey through the deadliest blizzard in frontier history, carrying medicine that could save dozens of children from scarlet fever. But would he reach them in time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high country of Colorado held secrets that most men would never know. At 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air grew thin and the winters stretched 6 months long, the world operated by different rules. Only the hardiest souls made their homes in these mountains, and fewer still chose to live there, alone. Jericho Croft was one of those rare few, a man who had turned his back on civilization and found something close to peace in the silent company of pine trees and granite peaks. His cabin sat on a shoulder of land where Copper Ridge met the eastern face of Mount Wilson, positioned to catch the morning sun and sheltered from the worst of the prevailing winds by a thick stand of lodgepole pine. He had built it with his own hands 7 winters ago, selecting each log with care, notching them tight so the walls would hold against the storms that rolled through with biblical fury. The structure measured 16 feet by 20, modest by any standard, but it was tight and warm and entirely his own. Jericho was 58 years old that winter, though the mountain had carved lines into his face that made him appear a decade older. His beard hung thick and grey to the middle of his chest, never trimmed except when it grew long enough to catch sparks from the fire. His hands were broad and scarred, the fingers thick as axe handles, capable of setting a trap in frozen water or skinning a beaver pelt without tearing the valuable hide. Those hands had built his cabin, fed him through 7 winters, and kept him alive when weaker men would have perished. The cabin's interior reflected the practical minimalism of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. A bed occupied the southeast corner, built from pine logs and filled with fresh boughs he replaced every few weeks to keep them springy and sweet-smelling. His workbench stood opposite, cluttered with the tools of his trade: steel traps in various sizes, coils of snare wire, skinning knives kept sharp enough to shave with, jars of rendered fat for waterproofing leather, and the worn whetstone he used every evening to maintain his blades. The stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its chimney rising through the center of the roof to draw the smoke up and away. Cast-iron hooks held his cookpot over the flames, and a Dutch oven sat on the hearth, ready for baking the occasional pan of cornbread. The fire burned constantly from October through April, fed with split pine and juniper that filled the cabin with their clean, resinous scent. Shelves lined the west wall, holding his provisions: sacks of cornmeal and flour, bought in Silverton the previous fall, dried beans in canvas bags, salt pork wrapped in cloth, strips of elk jerky hanging from pegs, jars of wild honey he had traded for with a Ute family who knew the location of every bee tree within 50 miles. A man who lived this high and this alone needed to think 3 months ahead at all times, needed to stock his shelves like a squirrel storing nuts before winter. He owned 6 books, and they sat on a shelf above his bed where he could reach them easily in the evening. A leather-bound Bible his mother had pressed into his hands 40 years ago when he left home. Robinson Crusoe, with a cracked spine and foxed pages, a volume of Walt Whitman's poetry that he understood only partially, but found strangely moving. A farmer's almanac from 1889, outdated but still useful for its moon tables and weather predictions. the complete tragedies of William Shakespeare, which he read aloud sometimes just to hear the sound of formal language in the wilderness. Silence, and a thick medical text he had found, abandoned in a played-out mining camp, its pages filled with anatomical drawings and descriptions of diseases and their treatments. The books were his companions during the long winter evenings, when darkness came early and the wind howled around the cabin eaves. He would sit close to the fire with a book open on his lap, reading by the flickering light until his eyes grew too tired to continue. Then he would stare into the flames and let his thoughts drift where they would, often back to the life he had left behind in the flatlands. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. The young man who had worked cattle ranches in New Mexico, who had married a woman named Sarah with yellow hair and a laugh that could light up a room, who had held his newborn son and thought his heart might burst from happiness. That man had died when fever took his wife and child in the same terrible week. The man who remained, the one who had drifted from town to town for a decade, doing whatever work he could find, never staying long enough to form attachments, that man had been hollow and angry and looking for a way to disappear. The mountain had given him that gift. Up here, he could go weeks without seeing another human being. The silence was profound, broken only by natural sounds, wind in the pines, the call of ravens, the distant crack of ice on the high peaks. He had learned to read this landscape like other men read newspapers, understanding the story told by animal tracks in snow, the meaning of a sudden stillness in the forest, the threat carried by certain cloud formations on the northern horizon. His daily routine held the comfort of ritual. He woke before dawn, built up the fire, and put coffee on to boil, real coffee beans that he ground himself, not the chicory substitute some trappers made do with. While the coffee heated, he would step outside in his long underwear and boots to check the weather and scan the tree line. The cold morning air never failed to clear his head and sharpen his senses. Breakfast was simple but sustaining. Cornmeal mush with honey and a piece of jerky. Sometimes a fried egg if the chickens he kept in a small coop beside the cabin were laying. After eating, he would dress in layers, wool shirt, buckskin tunic, canvas coat, and strap on his snowshoes for the daily circuit of his trapline. He maintained 40 traps set in a wide loop that took most of the day to walk. Each trap was positioned with care near a game trail or water source where marten, beaver, and occasional fox were likely to pass. Checking the traps was cold, monotonous work, but it gave structure to his days and brought in the money he needed to buy supplies. Good pelts fetched solid prices in Silverton, enough to keep him in flour and coffee and the other small necessities he could not produce himself. Evenings were for the work that could be done indoors by firelight, skinning whatever animals he had caught, stretching the pelts on wooden frames to dry, repairing traps damaged by struggling animals or harsh weather, mending his clothing, sharpening his tools, cooking his supper, and then, when the practical work was done, reading until his eyes grew heavy and sleep came to claim him. It was a hard life, but an honest one, and for 7 years it had been enough. The loneliness that had driven him to the mountain in the first place had gradually transformed into something else. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of acceptance. He had learned to carry his grief without letting it crush him, had found a way to keep living even though the people he had loved most were gone. He had one regular visitor who appeared every few weeks like a ghost materializing from the forest. Nashota was a Ute elder who maintained a winter camp 2 valleys over, a man of perhaps 70 winters, who moved through the mountains with a silence that seemed impossible for someone his age. They would share a meal and exchange information, weather patterns, animal movements, news from the occasional travelers Nashota encountered. They spoke little, their communication consisting mostly of gestures and comfortable silence. 2 men who understood what it meant to choose solitude without being lonely. The winter of 1893 arrived early, and with unusual ferocity. By mid-November, snow already lay 3 feet deep around the cabin, and the temperature at night dropped low enough to freeze water in a bucket by the fire. The old-timers in Silverton had predicted a hard winter, reading signs in the thickness of animal coats and the early migration of birds. Jericho had prepared accordingly, laying in extra firewood and provisions, making sure every crack in the cabin walls was properly chinked against the cold. When Nashota made his last visit in early December, he brought a warning. A great storm was building far to the north, he said. A storm unlike any in living memory. He advised Jericho to prepare for snow, measured in feet rather than inches, for winds that would tear at the cabin and temperatures that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. Then the old Ute had disappeared back into the forest, heading for the lower elevations where his people waited out the worst of winter. Jericho had taken the warning seriously. He spent the next week in a frenzy of preparation, cutting and splitting firewood until he had enough to last a month, filling every container with water before the streams froze solid, checking and rechecking his provisions and equipment. When you lived alone on a mountain, preparation was not just prudent. It was the difference between survival and death. The storm arrived 4 days before Christmas, rolling in from the northwest like a grey wall that swallowed the sky. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the space of an hour. Then the snow began, not the gentle floating flakes of an ordinary winter storm, but hard pellets that stung exposed skin and piled up at a rate Jericho had never witnessed. The wind rose to a howl, shaking the cabin and driving snow through gaps he had thought were sealed. For 3 days and nights, the storm raged without pause. Jericho kept the fire burning hot, burning through wood faster than he liked, but knowing that staying warm was more important than conserving fuel. The cabin groaned and creaked under the assault, snow piling against the north wall until it reached halfway up the windows. He could barely see out, the glass covered with frost on the inside and driven snow on the outside. On the 4th night, Jericho sat by the fire with his medical text open on his lap, though he was not really reading. His mind kept drifting to thoughts of the people who lived down in the valleys and towns, wondering how they were weathering this storm. The miners at Prospect Ridge would be holed up in their bunkhouses, unable to work. The families in Silverton would be burning through their winter stores faster than planned. The isolated homesteaders scattered through the mountains would be fighting their own battles against the cold and snow. He was thinking about whether to add another log to the fire when he heard something that made him lift his head in surprise. A sound that did not belong to the storm. The braying of a donkey, faint but unmistakable, carrying that particular note of distress that any man who had worked with animals would recognize instantly. Jericho set down his book and moved to the door, pressing his ear against the oak planks. There it was again, closer now, multiple animals calling out in voices made thin by exhaustion and cold. He lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. The storm hit him like a physical blow. Snow drove into his face with stinging force. The wind tried to tear the door from his grasp. The cold was so intense it burned his lungs when he drew breath. He squinted into the white chaos, one hand gripping the doorframe to keep his balance. For a moment, he saw nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Then 3 shapes materialized from the storm, stumbling toward the cabin with the lurching gait of creatures at the very end of their strength. 3 donkeys, their bodies coated in ice, their long ears drooping with exhaustion, their legs trembling. They were tied together with a lead rope, the front animal barely able to hold its head up. Their breath came in labored gasps that sent clouds of steam into the frigid air. There was no rider, no handler, no sign of any human presence. Just 3 dying animals that had somehow found their way to his door through a blizzard that should have killed them hours ago. Jericho did not hesitate. He grabbed the lead rope of the first donkey and pulled, coaxing the exhausted animals toward the cabin entrance. The doorway was barely wide enough, but desperation lent him strength. He guided the first donkey inside, then the second, then the third, pulling them into the warmth and light of his cabin. Snow cascaded from their bodies, melting immediately on the warm floor. He slammed the door shut behind them and barred it against the storm. Then he turned to face his unexpected guests, 3 half-frozen donkeys standing in the center of his cabin, shivering violently, their coats matted with ice and snow. They were in terrible condition. Without immediate help, they would not survive the night. But as Jericho looked at them more closely, he noticed something that made his breath catch. The animals were loaded with canvas packs, carefully secured and wrapped in oilcloth. Someone had taken great care to protect whatever cargo they carried, and burned into the led donkey's halter, he could just make out a familiar symbol, the staff and serpent of medicine, along with the initials A.T. Dr. Aris Thorne's mark. The only physician for 100 miles had sent his donkeys through a deadly storm, loaded with something important enough to risk their lives. But where was the doctor himself? Jericho knew he would find the answer in those canvas packs. But first, he had to save the animals. He moved quickly, gathering every blanket and spare piece of cloth he owned, rubbing down each donkey to remove the ice from their coats and work circulation back into their cold, stiffened muscles. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside his crowded cabin, Jericho Croft worked to save 3 lives, not knowing that by doing so, he was about to change his own life in ways he could never have imagined. The mountain had sent him a choice, delivered to his door by 3 dying animals. He had pulled them inside, and in doing so, had opened himself to something he had been avoiding for 7 years, a connection to the world beyond his cabin, a responsibility to people he had never met, and a chance at redemption he did not know he was seeking. By midnight, Jericho had managed to stabilize the 3 donkeys. He had worked methodically, drawing on years of experience with livestock, doing everything he could to warm them and restore their strength. The lead donkey, a sturdy grey with a distinctive white blaze running down its face, had recovered enough to nuzzle his shoulder as he worked, a gesture he chose to interpret as gratitude. The other 2, both browns with darker points on their legs and muzzles, stood with their heads low, but their breathing steady. They were no longer in immediate danger of dying from exposure. The cabin had transformed from a solitary refuge into something resembling a barn. Water puddled across the floor where snow had melted from the donkeys' coats. The air was thick with the smell of wet animal hide mixed with wood smoke and the earthy scent of hay. Jericho's carefully organized space had been reduced to chaos, but he found he did not mind. Saving 3 lives felt like a victory against the mountain's casual cruelty, a small triumph in a winter that had already claimed too many victims. But now that the immediate crisis had passed, his attention turned fully to the mystery that had been nagging at him since he first pulled the animals inside. Where was Dr. Thorne? Why had these donkeys arrived alone? And what cargo was so important that someone would send pack animals through a storm that killed men with indifferent ease? Jericho moved to the lead donkey and ran his hand along its neck, finding the leather halter. The leather was good quality, well-oiled and carefully stitched, not the cheap tack typically used on working animals. He turned the halter toward the firelight and examined the brand more closely, the staff and serpent of medicine, and below it, the initials A.T. in smaller letters, Dr. Aris Thorne. The name carried weight throughout the mining camps and settlements scattered across these mountains. Thorne was more than just a physician. He was a legend. A man who would ride through any weather to reach a patient, who set broken bones and delivered babies, and fought disease with the same grim determination other men brought to prospecting or ranching. People told stories about him in the saloons and trading posts, stories that grew with each retelling but were rooted in genuine respect. But if these were Thorne's animals, Where was the doctor himself? No man would send his donkeys off, alone, unless something had gone terribly wrong. Jericho approached the canvas packs that were still secured to the animals' backs. The packs had been attached with unusual care, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with multiple knots pulled tight. Someone had taken extraordinary measures to protect the contents from moisture and cold. He began working at the frozen knots, his thick fingers clumsy at first from the residual cold. The rope was stiff with ice, the knots pulled tight by the weight of the cargo and frozen solid by the temperature. He had to warm each knot with his hands, breathing on them and rubbing them between his palms until the ice melted enough to let him work the rope loose. 20 minutes of patient effort got the first pack open. Jericho pulled back the oilcloth covering and found something completely unexpected. No gold, no provisions, no personal effects. Instead, he discovered rows of glass vials nested in carefully arranged layers of straw and sawdust. Each vial was no bigger than his thumb, sealed with a cork stopper and wax. The labels were written in neat handwriting. Diphtheria antitoxin, scarlet fever serum. Each one included a date and a numbered designation. He lifted one of the vials with careful fingers, holding it up to the firelight. The liquid inside was clear with a faint amber tint, viscous like honey, but thinner. Jericho had read about serums in his medical text, understood in a general way that they were medicines derived from the blood of animals that had survived certain diseases. But he had never actually seen any. They were expensive, difficult to produce, and rarely available outside of big city hospitals back east. The first pack held 20 vials, each one cushioned to prevent breakage during transport. The second pack contained even more serum, along with several larger bottles marked with chemical names he did not recognize. The third pack, the one strapped to the smallest donkey, held bandages, surgical instruments wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust, and a thick leather journal bound with a strap. Jericho unbuckled the journal with fingers that had begun to tremble, though whether from cold or premonition he could not say. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was the same as on the vial labels. Precise, controlled, the work of an educated man who took care with his words. He flipped through the pages until he reached the most recent entries, holding the journal close to the fire so he could read the cramped text. December 18th, 1893. The quarantine continues. 17 new cases of scarlet fever reported in the past 3 days, 12 of them children under the age of 10. The disease is spreading faster than we can contain it. Without the anti-serum from Denver, we will lose half the children in Silverton before this outbreak runs its course. I have informed the town council that we need that medicine as quickly as possible, no matter the cost. December 19th, 1893. Word arrived this morning that the serum shipment has reached Durango. The railroad managed to get it through before the storm closed the passes. I will make the journey to retrieve it myself, despite Mary's objections, and despite the worsening weather conditions. Every day we delay means more deaths. I have left instructions with Mary Henderson to continue the isolation protocols and maintain the fever ward in my absence. God willing, I will return within a week with the medicine these children need. December 20th, 1893. Departed Silverton at first light with my 3 donkeys and supplies for a week-long journey. The sky looks threatening, but I cannot afford to wait for better weather. Already this morning I received word that 2 more children have fallen ill. Time is running out. The entries continued for several more pages, documenting Dr. Thorne's journey south to Durango, his successful retrieval of the serum from the railroad depot, and the beginning of his return journey north toward Silverton. The handwriting remained steady and controlled, the observations precise and methodical. Then Jericho reached the final entry, dated December 23rd, just yesterday. The writing here was different, shaky and irregular, the letters cramped and increasingly difficult to decipher. Cannot feel my hands anymore. The storm came on faster than I anticipated, temperature dropping rapidly. Snow so thick I can barely see the donkeys in front of me. We are somewhere north of the Prospect Ridge Trail, I think, but I cannot be certain. The cold is getting worse. My fingers are going numb, despite the gloves. There was a gap in the writing, a blank space where minutes or perhaps an hour had passed. Then the writing resumed, even shakier than before, the words running together in places. The donkeys are struggling, but still moving. I can see a light ahead on the mountain. A cabin, perhaps, or a mine entrance. Must reach shelter. So cold. Cannot feel my feet anymore. Hands freezing. The donkeys are slowing down. I am slowing down. Not sure how much longer I can continue. Another gap. Longer, this time. When the writing resumed, it was barely legible. The letters shaky and poorly formed. Obviously written by someone whose hands were no longer functioning properly. I will not make it. Too cold. Hands frozen. Cannot hold the reins anymore. Cannot feel anything below my wrists. The light on the mountain is still ahead, but I am too weak to reach it. The donkeys might make it, if I send them forward without me. Tying the animals together now, pointing them toward that light on the mountain, going to whip them forward, make them run. Someone must deliver this medicine to Silverton. Children are dying. Someone must save them. Tell Mary I tried. Tell her I love her. Tell her I am sorry I couldn't. The entry ended there. The final sentence left unfinished, trailing off into nothing. The last few letters were barely recognizable as writing, just shaky marks made by a hand that could no longer properly grip the pen. Jericho stood in the center of his crowded cabin, holding a dead man's journal, and felt the full weight of what had happened settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Dr. Aris Thorne had frozen to death somewhere on the mountain. Probably within hours of writing that final entry, he had used his last moments of consciousness to tie his donkeys together and send them toward the only light visible through the storm, Jericho's cabin, knowing he would not survive, but hoping the animals would, hoping that whoever found them would understand what they carried and would finish the journey he could not complete. The doctor had sacrificed his own life to give the medicine a chance of reaching its destination. He had driven his animals forward even as death closed in, had chosen to spend his final moments ensuring that the serum might still save the children he served. And now that burden, that responsibility, that choice had fallen to Jericho Croft. He closed the journal carefully and set it aside, his mind racing. The medicine was here, safe in his cabin. Down in Silverton, perhaps 40 or 50 miles distant, children were dying of scarlet fever. They were waiting for medicine their doctor had given his life trying to deliver. The serum represented the difference between life and death. For how many children? A dozen? 2 dozen? The journal had mentioned 12 new cases in just 3 days. But there would be others, and more would fall sick every day the outbreak continued unchecked. Jericho moved to the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the storm. The wind had not diminished. If anything, it seemed to have grown stronger, the snow falling so thick he could not see more than a few feet beyond his threshold. The temperature had dropped even further, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill an unprepared traveler before he made it a mile down the mountain. Somewhere in Silverton, children were dying. Somewhere down in that valley, families were watching their sons and daughters burn with fever, helpless to do anything but wait and hope. The medicine that could save them sat in canvas packs in his cabin, brought here by 3 faithful animals and a doctor's dying act of courage. Jericho could stay here. He could wait out the storm in safety and warmth. No one would blame him. No one would even know he had the medicine. When the weather finally cleared, in a week or perhaps 2 weeks, he could load the packs onto the donkeys and make his way down to Silverton. He could explain what had happened and deliver the serum then. But how many children would die in those 2 weeks? How many families would lose their sons and daughters because he had chosen safety over urgency, because he had decided his own comfort was more important than their desperate need? He thought of Dr. Thorne stumbling through the blizzard, knowing he was dying but pushing forward anyway, using the last of his strength to send the donkeys ahead. The doctor had made his choice. He had weighed his own life against the lives of the children he served, and he had chosen the children without hesitation. Could Jericho do any less? Could he live with himself if he stayed safe while children died from a disease that could be prevented? The answer, he realized, was no. He could not stay. He could not wait. Despite the storm, despite the danger, despite every rational argument for remaining in his cabin, he could not sit idle while children perished for want of medicine he could deliver. Dr. Thorne's sacrifice demanded that someone finish what he had started. Those 3 donkeys had not stumbled through a deadly storm to die in Jericho's cabin. They had come to find help, to find someone willing to complete the mission their master had died attempting. Jericho Croft closed the door and turned back to face his cabin. He looked at the 3 exhausted donkeys, at the precious vials of serum packed carefully in straw, at the journal with its unfinished final entry. Then he began to prepare for a journey that might very well kill him. He would attempt what no sane man would consider. He would take the medicine down the mountain through the worst storm anyone could remember. He would risk his life to save children he had never met, children whose names he did not know, children who would never learn who had delivered the medicine that saved them. He would do it because Dr. Thorne had shown him what courage looked like. He would do it because somewhere in his cabin, buried under 7 years of isolation and grief, there was still a man who understood that some things were worth dying for. The winter of the White Death had claimed Dr. Aris Thorne. Now it would test Jericho Croft, and he would either deliver the medicine or die in the attempt. There was no middle ground, no safe option, no way to hedge his bets. He had been given a choice, delivered to his door by 3 freezing donkeys, carrying medicine and a dead man's final words. Now he had to find the courage to see that choice through to whatever end awaited him on the mountain. Preparation was everything. Jericho had learned that lesson through 7 winters on the mountain, watching men die because they had underestimated the cold or overestimated their own abilities. If he was going to attempt this journey, and he had already decided he was, then he needed to do it right. Half measures would only get him killed without accomplishing anything. He started with clothing, building layers the way a mason builds a wall, each one adding strength to the whole. First his heavy wool pants, then a second pair over the first. The extra layer would restrict his movement somewhat, but the added warmth was worth the trade. 2 wool shirts, then his buckskin tunic, then his thick wool coat reinforced with canvas at the shoulders and elbows. 2 pairs of socks inside his waterproofed boots, his fur hat, with ear flaps that tied under his chin, a wool scarf long enough to wrap around his face multiple times, thick mittens lined with rabbit fur that would keep his hands warm even in the worst cold. When he finished dressing, he could barely bend his arms, but every exposed inch of skin was covered. In weather like this, exposed skin meant frostbite, and frostbite could cost him fingers, toes, or his life. Next, he had to decide which donkey to take. The 3 animals were exhausted from their ordeal, and taking all of them would be impossible in this storm. He chose the grey with the white blaze, the lead animal that had recovered the most quickly. It was the strongest of the 3 and the most sure-footed, qualities that might mean the difference between success and failure. He repacked the medicine with meticulous care, selecting only the most critical vials and leaving the rest behind. If he did not survive the journey, perhaps someone else would find his cabin and the remaining medicine. He cushioned each vial in fresh straw, wrapped the whole collection in oilcloth, and packed everything into 2 canvas bags that he could balance on the donkey's pack frame. The total weight came to perhaps 60 pounds, a reasonable load for a healthy animal. He added Dr. Thorne's journal, wrapped in additional oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The doctor's fiancée would want it, would want to know his final thoughts, and if Jericho did not survive, Whoever found his frozen body would at least understand what he had been trying to accomplish. Food for himself, strips of jerky, pieces of hardtack that would not freeze solid, a small bag of cornmeal. He could not carry much without adding too much weight, but he needed something to keep his strength up. He filled 2 canteens with water, knowing he could melt snow if necessary, but preferring to have clean water readily available. His rifle. He pulled it from its pegs on the wall, checked that it was loaded, and added a box of extra cartridges to his pack. The storm was the main danger, but bears sometimes came down from the high country during harsh weather, and a desperate bear was nearly as dangerous as the cold itself. He added his hunting knife in its sheath, a hatchet for cutting firewood, and a coil of rope. Matches in a waterproof tin, perhaps his most precious resource. A small pot for melting snow. A wool blanket rolled tight and strapped to his back. Flint and steel as backup for the matches. His compass, though he suspected it would be nearly useless in a storm this severe. When he finished, the grey donkey was loaded with supplies, carefully balanced to prevent shifting. It was not an unreasonable burden for a healthy animal, and the donkey accepted the weight without protest, as if it understood the importance of what they were attempting. Jericho looked around his cabin one final time. The fire burned low in the hearth. The 2 remaining donkeys stood near the warmth, their heads drooping in exhaustion, but their bodies stable. His books sat on their shelf. His traps hung on their pegs. His bed waited in the corner. This place had been his refuge, his sanctuary, his entire world for 7 years. He could stay. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to bar the door and wait for better weather. But he thought of children burning with fever, their small bodies fighting a disease that the medicine in those packs could cure. He thought of Dr. Thorne's shaky handwriting, the unfinished sentence about Mary. He thought of his own son, dead at 3 months old, and how he would have given anything for medicine that might have saved him. The choice was not really a choice at all. Jericho opened the door, and the storm hit him like a fist. The wind tried to tear the door from his grasp, drove snow into his face, despite the layers of wool wrapped around his head. The cold was stunning in its intensity, stealing his breath, making his eyes water instantly. He pulled the grey donkey out into the maelstrom, then turned back to close and bar the door behind him. For just a moment, he looked at the warm glow of his cabin through the driving snow. Then he turned his face south and started walking, leading the donkey into the white chaos. The world disappeared within seconds. He could not see the cabin behind him, could not see more than a few feet ahead. Snow filled the air so thickly it was like walking through a curtain, each step taking him deeper into blindness. The wind howled and shrieked, grabbing at his coat, pushing him sideways, trying to knock him off his feet. He kept his head down and concentrated on putting one snowshoe in front of the other. The snowshoes were essential. Without them, he would sink to his waist in the deep powder. With them, he could walk on top of the snow, though each step still required effort, lifting his feet high and setting them down carefully. The grey donkey followed behind, its head low, trusting him to lead them safely. Jericho held the lead rope firmly, knowing that if they became separated in this storm, he would never find the animal again. He had planned to follow the main trail down toward Widow's Canyon, a route that would take him through lower elevation passes and away from the most exposed ridgelines. But finding the trail in these conditions was proving impossible. He had to navigate by instinct and memory, keeping the wind at a certain angle to his left shoulder, trying to maintain a generally southern heading. After what felt like an hour, but might have been only 20 minutes, Jericho's legs were burning with exertion, and his face felt raw despite the scarf. Snow had worked its way into his clothing, melting against his skin and then freezing. Ice was forming in his beard and eyebrows. His breath came in gasps that sent clouds of steam into the frozen air. He spotted a darker shadow through the snow, a thick stand of pines growing close together. He pushed toward it, fighting through waist-deep drifts, and found marginal shelter beneath the densest part of the canopy. The wind still howled overhead, but here between the trunks, the worst of it was deflected. He tied the donkey to a sturdy branch and cleared snow away from the base of a large pine, exposing the dry needles beneath. His hands were clumsy inside the thick mittens. When he pulled them off to work the waterproof tin open, the cold bit into his fingers with shocking ferocity. He had perhaps 30 seconds before frostbite would start to damage the tissue. Working with desperate speed, he struck a match and held it to a piece of birch bark he had tucked into the tin. The match flared and caught. He added dry pine needles, then small twigs, building the fire with the careful patience of a man who understood his life depended on getting this right. The fire struggled at first, the flames guttering in the wind that managed to penetrate even this shelter, but it caught and held, and within minutes he had a small blaze burning in the depression he had cleared. It would not last long and would not provide much heat, but it would give him a chance to warm his hands and check his bearings. He crouched beside the fire, holding his hands near the flames, feeling the painful tingling as sensation returned to his fingers. The donkey stood nearby, its back to the wind, steam rising from its coat. The animal was holding up well, but this journey was going to test both of them to their limits. Jericho consulted his mental map of the terrain. If he was where he thought he was, Widow's Canyon lay another 2 or 3 miles southeast. At the rate they were moving, it would take hours to reach it, and once they descended into the canyon, they would face new challenges. Crossing the creek, finding the trail through the narrow defile, avoiding the avalanche slopes on the canyon walls. But there was another option, one that had been forming in the back of his mind since he left the cabin. Prospect Ridge Mining Camp lay perhaps a day's journey from here, maybe less if he could find the right trail. The camp was small, but the miners would have runners who could take the medicine the rest of the way to Silverton, while Jericho stayed behind to recover. The problem was finding Prospect Ridge in this storm. The camp was accessible only by a narrow trail that switchbacked up the canyon's eastern face. In good weather it was clearly marked. In a blizzard it would be nearly invisible. But if he could find it, he might cut 2 days off the delivery time. 2 days that could mean the difference between life and death for the children waiting in Silverton. Jericho made his decision. He would try for Prospect Ridge. If he could not find the trail by tomorrow, he would abandon the attempt and continue to Silverton by the longer route. He gave himself 10 minutes by the fire, no more, long enough to warm his hands and let the donkey rest briefly. Then he kicked snow over the flames, shouldered his rifle, and stepped back out into the storm. The grey donkey followed without hesitation, as if it understood that survival meant keeping moving. The wind seemed to have grown even stronger. It roared through the trees with a sound like distant thunder, snapping branches and sending cascades of snow tumbling from the upper canopy. Jericho leaned into it, fighting for every step, his legs burning with exertion, his lungs aching from breathing the frozen air. He was committed now, had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Behind him lay the safety of his cabin. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of death. But also ahead, somewhere beyond the storm, lay children who needed the medicine he carried. That thought kept him moving when his body screamed for rest, kept him putting one foot in front of the other through the endless white chaos. Dr. Thorne had died for those children. The least Jericho could do was risk his life trying to complete what the doctor had started. The storm swallowed him, and he disappeared into the white, a lone figure leading a burdened donkey through the deadliest blizzard in living memory, carrying hope in canvas packs and determination in his heart. The descent toward Widow's Canyon tested Jericho in ways he hadn't anticipated. The terrain sloped downward at a deceptive angle, steep enough to make each step treacherous, but gradual enough that he could not see the danger until he was already committed. Snow covered everything, hiding rocks and fallen logs, concealing holes and crevices that could snap a man's leg or send a donkey tumbling down the mountainside. He moved with painful slowness, probing ahead with his rifle butt before committing his weight to each step. Behind him, the grey donkey picked its way with the sure instincts of a mountain-bred animal, finding solid footing where his larger boots sometimes slipped. The donkey's ability to navigate this treacherous terrain filled him with respect and gratitude. Without the animal's steady presence, he would have lost his way hours ago. As they descended, Jericho became aware of a new sound beneath the wind's howl, the rush and gurgle of moving water. Widow's Canyon took its name from the creek that ran through it, a fast-flowing stream that rarely froze completely, even in the coldest weather. He was approaching the water, which meant both progress and new danger. The sound grew louder as he continued downward. He stopped, trying to gauge the creek's location through the white chaos. The rushing water seemed to come from directly ahead, perhaps 30 yards distant. He moved forward carefully, testing each step. The ground beneath his snowshoes grew softer, the snow wetter. He was approaching the creek bank. He stopped at what he judged to be a safe distance and tried to assess the situation through the driving snow. The creek was perhaps 12 to 15 feet across, running black and more swift through a channel cut deep into the snow. Ice formed along the edges where the water slowed, but the center ran clear and fast, the current too strong to freeze. Crossing it would mean wading through knee-deep water that would soak through his boots and pants despite their waterproofing. In this temperature, wet clothes could kill him within hours. Jericho moved along the bank, searching for a better crossing point. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, but after several minutes of careful searching, he found what he was looking for: a large pine that had fallen across the creek, its trunk forming a natural bridge about 3 feet above the rushing water. The trunk was covered in snow and ice, slippery as glass, but it was wide enough to walk across if he was careful. The problem was the donkey. The animal could not cross on the log, which meant wading through the icy water was unavoidable for it. Jericho tied the donkey's lead rope to a nearby tree and tested the log bridge himself first. He stepped onto the trunk carefully, his arms out for balance, his snowshoes removed and strapped to his pack. The bark was treacherous beneath his boots, and the log shifted slightly under his weight. But it held. He moved across slowly, one cautious step at a time, trying not to think about the ice-cold water rushing below. He made it across and jumped down on the far bank, his knees protesting the impact. Now for the harder part. He returned across the log and untied the donkey. The animal's ears were flat against its head when it saw the water, and it pulled back on the lead rope, clearly not wanting to enter that rushing current. Jericho could not blame it. The water looked deadly, and the donkey had already been half frozen once in the past 24 hours. "I know, friend," Jericho said, his voice barely audible over the wind and water. "But we have to get across. Those children need us." He applied steady pressure to the lead rope, coaxing rather than forcing. The donkey resisted for a long moment, its hooves planted, its whole body tense with reluctance. Then it took a tentative step into the water, and another, and suddenly it was committed, pushing forward through the current. The water rose to the donkey's chest, and for a terrible moment, Jericho thought the current might sweep the animal downstream, but the donkey's powerful legs drove against the flow, its hooves finding purchase on the rocky bottom. It pushed forward with determination, water streaming from its coat, its breath coming in harsh gasps. Then it was across, scrambling up the far bank with water cascading from its body. Jericho grabbed his blanket and immediately began rubbing the animal down, working to remove the worst of the water before it could freeze in the donkey's coat. Steam rose from the animal's body in thick clouds, and its sides heaved with exertion, but it had made the crossing. They needed shelter quickly. The donkey was soaking wet, and the temperature was still well below zero. Without a chance to dry off and warm up, hypothermia would set in fast. Jericho scanned the canyon walls through the snow, looking for any kind of shelter. About 50 yards upstream, he spotted a dark opening in the rock face, a shallow cave or overhang where they might escape the wind. He led the donkey toward it, his own body aching with cold and exhaustion. Every step felt like it required twice the effort it should. His legs were heavy, his movements sluggish. The cold was starting to affect his thinking, making everything seem slower and harder than it should be. The opening turned out to be deeper than it had appeared from a distance, extending back about 10 feet into the rock face. The floor was dry, covered with old pine needles and the charred remains of a fire. Someone had used this shelter before, probably trappers or hunters caught out in bad weather. Jericho led the donkey inside and felt immediate relief from the wind's assault. He could not risk a fire in here. The smoke would fill the shallow space and choke them both. But at least they were out of the wind, and that made an enormous difference. He continued rubbing down the donkey vigorously, paying special attention to its legs and chest where the water had soaked deepest. The animal stood docile under his ministrations, too exhausted to do anything but accept his help. While he worked, Jericho's mind turned to the path ahead. They had covered perhaps 3 miles in 4 hours of brutal travel. At this rate, reaching Prospect Ridge would take another 8 or 10 hours, assuming he could even find the trail in this storm. And the hardest part still lay ahead. The switchback trail that climbed the canyon's eastern face, a narrow path with deadly exposure on one side, but he had no choice except to continue. Turning back now would mean those children died. Dr. Thorne's sacrifice would mean nothing. The medicine would sit uselessly in his cabin while scarlet fever burned through Silverton unchecked. As he worked to dry off the donkey, Jericho thought about the doctor's journal, about those final shaky words written by a dying man. "Tell Mary I tried." The simple honesty of that message struck him deeply. Thorne had not tried to be heroic or dramatic. He had simply done his best and hoped it would be enough. That was all any man could do, try his best and accept the outcome. Jericho finished drying the donkey and settled down beside the animal, pulling his wool blanket over both of them. The cave was not warm, but it was out of the wind, and the combined body heat made it bearable. He pulled out a piece of jerky and forced himself to eat it, despite having no appetite. The body needed fuel, especially in this cold. He offered water to the donkey from his canteen, and the animal drank eagerly. Then Jericho allowed himself a few swallows, conserving what remained. They would need to melt snow soon, but that would require a fire, and he wanted to save his matches for true emergencies. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains. Inside the shallow cave, Jericho Croft tried to rest, knowing that the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. His body ached in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. His face was raw from the wind, his hands throbbed from repeated exposure to extreme cold, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. But he was alive. The donkey was alive, and the medicine was still safe in its canvas packs. Tomorrow he would attempt to find the trail to Prospect Ridge. If he succeeded, he would cut significant time off the journey. If he failed, he would continue on to Silverton by the longer route. Either way, he would keep moving forward, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant children died. Jericho closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Though the cold made true rest impossible, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with images of snow and wind, of children burning with fever, of a doctor's shaky handwriting in a journal, of his own son's small face that he could barely remember anymore after so many years. When he jerked awake some unknown time later, he could not tell if he had slept for minutes or hours. The darkness in the cave was absolute. The wind still howled outside, though perhaps not quite as fiercely as before. The donkey's breathing was steady and strong beside him, a comforting sound in the blackness. Jericho fumbled for his waterproof tin and struck a match, holding it up to see his surroundings. The brief flare of light revealed the cave interior, unchanged from when he had closed his eyes. He checked the donkey, running his hands over its body to make sure it was not showing signs of hypothermia. The animal seemed stable, its coat mostly dry now, its body temperature normal. He let the match burn down to his fingers before extinguishing it. They needed to conserve every resource. Each match represented potential warmth, potential survival. In the darkness, Jericho made a decision. He would rest here until first light, or what passed for first light in this storm. Then he would push on, searching for the trail to Prospect Ridge. Every hour he delayed meant more children at risk, but exhausting himself or the donkey would only ensure failure. It was a balance, and finding the right balance might be the difference between success and disaster. He settled back against the cave wall, the donkey warm beside him, and tried to prepare mentally for what tomorrow would bring. The climb up to Prospect Ridge would be the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. The trail was narrow, exposed, and deadly even in good weather. In this storm, it would be almost suicidal. But children were dying. That fact outweighed every other consideration, every fear, every rational argument for choosing a safer path. Jericho Croft had spent 7 years hiding from the world, avoiding risk, protecting himself from any possibility of loss. But hiding had not brought him peace. It had only brought numbness, a slow erosion of everything that made life worth living. Dr. Thorne had shown him another way, a way that involved sacrifice and risk and the possibility of failure, but also the possibility of meaning. The doctor had died trying to save children he had dedicated his life to serving. That death had meaning in a way that a safe, comfortable life never could. Tomorrow, Jericho would climb that trail. He would risk everything to deliver the medicine, and whether he succeeded or failed, he would know that he had tried, that he had chosen courage over safety, action over paralysis. It was enough. It had to be enough. Dawn came slowly, announced only by a slight lightening of the darkness rather than any actual sunlight. Jericho woke stiff and cold, every joint protesting as he forced himself to move. The donkey stirred beside him, its large eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the cave entrance. He checked the animal carefully, running his hands over its legs and body, looking for any signs of injury or illness. The donkey seemed stable, its breathing steady, its temperature normal. The night in the cave had allowed it to recover some strength, though it was far from fully rested. Jericho himself felt terrible. His muscles ached from yesterday's exertion. His face was wind-burned and raw, and the cold had settled into his bones in a way that made him feel decades older than his 58 years. But he was functional, and that would have to be enough. He stepped outside the cave to assess the weather. The storm had diminished somewhat overnight. The wind still blew hard, but no longer with that apocalyptic fury of the previous day. The snow fell steadily, but not as thickly, and he could see perhaps 20 or 30 yards through the white curtain. It was an improvement, marginal but real. He pulled out his compass and tried to get his bearings. The needle swung wildly at first, then settled on what he hoped was a true reading. According to the compass, Prospect Ridge lay to the southeast, and the trail should be somewhere along the canyon's eastern wall. Jericho gathered his minimal gear, loaded the donkey, and set out along the creek, heading downstream and watching the eastern canyon wall for any sign of the trail markers. The walking was easier today, with the slightly improved visibility, though still brutally hard. The snow lay deep, and each step required lifting his snowshoes high and setting them down carefully. After perhaps an hour of steady travel, he spotted something that made his heart lift. A line of cairns, small stacks of stones, barely visible under their covering of snow. These marked the beginning of a trail, and unless he was badly mistaken, this was the trail to Prospect Ridge. He stopped at the base of the slope and looked up, trying to trace the path through the snow. The trail switchbacked up the steep canyon wall, gaining elevation rapidly through a series of tight turns. From here, He could see only the first few switchbacks before the trail disappeared into the white chaos above. The slope was intimidating, even from the bottom. In good weather, with dry conditions and solid footing, this would be a strenuous but manageable climb. In these conditions, with deep snow hiding the trail's edge and ice making every step treacherous, it would be one of the most dangerous things he had ever attempted. But it was also the fastest way to get the medicine to people who could deliver it to Silverton. If he succeeded in making this climb, he would save at least 2 days, probably more. 2 days that might mean the difference between life and death for several children. Jericho started up the trail, testing each step carefully before committing his full weight. The donkey followed, its small hooves finding purchase where his larger boots sometimes slipped. The animal's mountain-bred instincts were remarkable. It seemed to sense instinctively which patches of snow concealed solid ground and which hid empty air. The climb was brutal from the first step. The trail had been cut into the canyon wall at a steep angle, and the exposure was terrifying. On his right, the slope rose sharply. On his left, it dropped away into nothing, a sheer fall of hundreds of feet to the rocks below. The trail itself was perhaps 3 feet wide in places, narrower where rockfall or erosion had eaten away at the path. Snow covered everything, making it impossible to see where the trail ended and the void began. Jericho moved with painful slowness, probing ahead with his rifle butt, testing the snow's depth and the solidity of the ground beneath. One wrong step, one moment of carelessness, and he would plunge over the edge, taking the donkey and the precious medicine with him. The wind grew stronger as they climbed, no longer deflected by the canyon walls. It came from the west, pushing him toward the cliff edge with remorseless force. He leaned into it, fighting for every step, his legs burning with exertion. The cold at this elevation was even more intense than down in the canyon, burning his lungs with each breath. Behind him, the donkey's breathing grew labored, but the animal kept moving, trusting him to lead them safely. Jericho felt the weight of that trust like a physical burden. This animal had already survived one impossible journey through this storm. Now he was asking it to make another. They were perhaps halfway up the switchback when disaster nearly struck. Jericho's boot broke through a snow cornice that had formed over the trail's edge, an overhanging lip of wind-packed snow that looked solid but was actually suspended over nothing. The ground beneath the snow simply was not there, just empty air and a long fall. His forward momentum carried him toward the edge. For one terrible heartbeat, he felt himself tipping forward into the void. Then instinct took over. He threw his weight backward, dropping to his hands and knees, his rifle sliding off his shoulder and disappearing over the edge with a clatter. He lay still for a moment. His heart. This animal had already survived one impossible journey through this storm. Now he was asking it to make another. They were perhaps halfway up the switchback when disaster nearly struck. Jericho's boot broke through a snow cornice that had formed over the trail's edge, an overhanging lip of wind-packed snow that looked solid but was actually suspended over nothing. The ground beneath the snow simply was not there, just empty air and a long fall. His forward momentum carried him toward the edge. For one terrible heartbeat, he felt himself tipping forward into the void. Then instinct took over. He threw his weight backward, dropping to his hands and knees, his rifle sliding off his shoulder and disappearing over the edge with a clatter. He lay still for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest, feeling the terror drain slowly from his system. That had been close, too close, a fraction of a second slower to react, and he would be lying broken on the rocks below. The donkey had stopped a few feet behind him, its eyes wide, sensing the danger. Jericho pulled himself carefully back from the edge, away from the treacherous cornice, and got back to his feet on shaking legs. He had lost the rifle, which meant he now had no defense against bears or mountain lions, if they encountered any. But he was alive. The donkey was alive, and the medicine was safe. Those were the things that mattered. He continued the climb, even more cautious now, testing every single step before putting weight on it. The trail seemed to go on forever, each switchback revealing another switchback above it, the summit never seeming to get any closer. His legs screamed with fatigue. His lungs burned from breathing the thin, frozen air. Sweat froze on his face, despite the cold. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant children died. That thought sustained him through the pain and exhaustion, gave him strength when his body wanted to quit. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2, the slope finally began to level off. Jericho pulled himself over the last rise and found himself standing on a broad, relatively flat area that marked the edge of Prospect Ridge. Through the snow, he could see darker shapes that might be buildings, perhaps a quarter-mile distant. He had made it. They had made it. Relief flooded through him, so intense it made his knees weak. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, letting the reality of their survival sink in. Then he gathered himself and started forward toward the mining camp, the grey donkey following steadily behind. As he drew closer, the shapes resolved into actual structures. 3 log buildings arranged in a loose triangle, smoke rising from at least 2 of them, a corral with a rough shelter for animals, signs of human habitation, of warmth and safety, of help. Jericho stumbled the last 100 yards, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that safety was within reach. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, focused only on reaching those buildings. The donkey's head hung low, but its steps remained steady. He reached the nearest building and pounded on the door with his fist. 3 heavy blows that echoed despite the wind. Then he leaned against the doorframe, using it to hold himself upright, waiting for someone to answer. The door opened a crack, and a bearded face peered out suspiciously. The man's expression changed from wariness to shock when he saw Jericho's ice-covered form and the loaded donkey standing behind him. "Sweet Jesus," the man breathed. "Who in their right mind travels in weather like this?" Jericho's voice came out rough and cracked, barely recognizable as his own. "Someone with medicine for Silverton. Scarlet fever outbreak. Got antitoxin that needs to reach the clinic. Can you help?" The man's eyes widened in recognition and understanding. "Dr. Thorne's medicine. We heard he died trying to get it through. You're the one who found his donkeys?" "I found them," Jericho confirmed, his words coming slowly, his thinking foggy from exhaustion and cold. "He sent them to my cabin. I brought the medicine here. Need someone to take it to Silverton while I rest. Children are dying." The bearded man pulled the door open wide without hesitation. Come in out of that cold. We'll get you warmed up and send our fastest man down the mountain with that medicine. It'll be in Silverton by tomorrow evening at the latest." He called over his shoulder. "Tommy, get out here. We got an emergency." Other miners appeared, crowding around, asking questions, helping Jericho guide the exhausted donkey inside, where it was warm. Someone took the lead rope from his numb fingers. Someone else pushed a chair toward him. A 3rd miner was already pulling on winter gear, preparing for a fast run down the mountain with the medicine. Jericho sat down gratefully, feeling the warmth of the building begin to penetrate his frozen clothing. Someone pressed a mug of hot coffee into his hands, and he wrapped his stiff fingers around it, feeling the heat seep into his bones. Through the fog of exhaustion, he watched the miners carefully unpack the medicine, exclaiming over the vials of serum, handling each one with reverence. A young miner, barely more than a boy, really, maybe 22 or 23 years old, was strapping the precious cargo into a pack frame, securing it with the same care Dr. Thorne had used. "His name's Tommy Bradshaw," the bearded miner said quietly to Jericho. "Lost his little sister to diphtheria 3 years back. When he heard what you were carrying, he volunteered before anyone else could speak up. He's the fastest man we've got, strong as an ox, knows every trail between here and Silverton, like the back of his hand." Jericho nodded, too tired to do more than register the information. Tommy finished securing the pack and headed for the door, his young face set with determination. He paused at the threshold and looked back at Jericho. "I'll get it there safe," the young man said. "You have my word." Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm, carrying medicine that would save lives and fulfill the mission a dying doctor had started. The miners of Prospect Ridge showed Jericho a hospitality that went beyond mere courtesy. They gave him the best bunk in their sleeping quarters, a narrow wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress that felt like the finest hotel bed. After his ordeal on the mountain, they fed him thick venison stew from a communal pot, pressed more hot coffee on him until he thought he might never feel cold again, and asked for his story with the quiet respect of men who understood exactly how close to death he had come. Jericho told them about finding the 3 donkeys at his cabin door, about reading Dr. Thorne's journal and realizing what needed to be done, about the brutal journey through the storm to reach their camp. The miners listened in silence, occasionally nodding or exchanging glances that showed they recognized the magnitude of what he had accomplished. These were men who knew the mountain's dangers intimately, who understood that traveling in that storm was tantamount to suicide. The fact that he had not only survived but had delivered the medicine safely earned him their respect in a way that words alone never could. Samuel, the bearded miner who had answered the door, seemed to be the unofficial leader of the group. He was perhaps 45, with strong hands, scarred from years of working with drill steel and dynamite, and eyes that missed little. "That young fellow who took the medicine," Samuel said, refilling Jericho's coffee mug. "Tommy Bradshaw is his name. He's the fastest man we've got, and he knows every trail and shortcut between here and Silverton. If anyone can get those vials delivered safely and quickly, it's him." "He mentioned losing his sister," Jericho said quietly. Samuel nodded, his expression somber. 3 years back, diphtheria outbreak. She was only 7 years old. Tommy was 19 at the time, working these same claims, trying to make enough money to bring his family out west from Ohio. He got word too late. Couldn't get back in time to say goodbye. When he heard what you were carrying, what it meant for the sick children in Silverton, he volunteered before the words were even out of your mouth. Jericho understood. Everyone had their reasons for doing what they did. Tommy Bradshaw had his, shaped by loss and regret. Jericho had his, forged from 7 years of isolation and the memory of his own son. Dr. Thorne had had his, driven by a commitment to healing that transcended personal safety. In the end, it all came down to the same thing, trying to protect the innocent from suffering that could be prevented. The storm continued through that day and into the night, though its fury gradually diminished. By the following morning, the wind had died down to occasional gusts, and the snow had lightened to scattered flurries. Jericho woke feeling somewhat recovered, though every muscle in his body still ached, and his face remained raw where the wind had scoured it. He found Samuel and the other miners in the main cabin, eating breakfast and discussing the day's work. The storm had kept them from the mine for 4 days, and they were eager to get back to it despite the cold. Silver didn't extract itself, and winter was expensive when you could not work. "How's the donkey?" Jericho asked, accepting a plate of beans and bacon. "Fed and watered. Seems no worse for wear, considering what you put it through," Samuel replied. "Tough animal. You planning to head back to your cabin?" It was a question Jericho had been wrestling with since he woke. His cabin was a good day's journey back the way he had come, assuming the trails were passable now that the storm had passed. But he found himself curiously reluctant to return to his isolated life quite yet. Something had changed during this journey, some fundamental shift in how he saw his place in the world. For 7 years, he had hidden on that mountain, using solitude as armor against further pain. But the past few days had shown him that isolation was not the same as healing, that safety was not the same as living. "I thought I might head down to Silverton," he heard himself say, the decision forming as he spoke. "Make sure the medicine arrived safely." See if Dr. Thorne's clinic needs any help." Samuel studied him with those perceptive eyes, then nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Good idea. Trail down from here should be passable now that the storm's clearing. You could make it by nightfall if you start within the hour." Jericho finished his breakfast, gathered his minimal gear, and prepared the grey donkey for travel. The other two animals were still back at his cabin, and he would need to retrieve them eventually, but that could wait. For now, he wanted to see this mission through to its conclusion, wanted to witness the outcome of what Dr. Thorne had died trying to accomplish. The miners came out to see him off, shaking his hand and clapping him on the shoulder. Several pressed small gifts into his hands, a pouch of silver nuggets, a new knife to replace the one he had lost, a package of real tobacco. Samuel walked with him to the edge of camp. "What you did," the older miner said quietly, "that took courage most men don't possess. Risking your life for children you'd never met. Finishing a dead man's mission. That's something worth doing. Something worth remembering." He pressed a small leather pouch into Jericho's hand. "From all of us. Silver nuggets, worth maybe $50. For what you did, and because you lost your rifle on that climb. $50 will buy you a good Winchester with money left over." Jericho tried to refuse, but Samuel's expression made it clear the gift was not optional. "You earned it," the miner said firmly. "Accept it with our respect and gratitude." Jericho accepted the pouch, tucking it into his coat pocket, and led the grey donkey down the trail toward Silverton. The descent was infinitely easier than the climb had been. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. Everything gleamed white under a pale sun that struggled to break through the remaining clouds. The temperature had risen to something almost bearable. As he walked, Jericho found himself thinking about what came next. He could return to his cabin and resume his solitary life as if nothing had happened. Go back to his trap lines and his books and his comfortable isolation. Pretend that the past few days had been an aberration, a brief interruption in 7 years of careful detachment. But would that be enough anymore? Could he really go back to that life, knowing what he now knew, that he was capable of more than just surviving? That his life could have purpose beyond mere existence. That connection to other people was not something to fear, but something that gave meaning to the days. The question troubled him because he didn't know the answer. Part of him still yearned for the mountain's silence, for the safety of solitude, for the peace that came from not having to care about anyone. But another part, a part that had been dormant for 7 years, wanted something different. Wanted to matter, wanted to be useful, wanted to be part of something larger than himself. Silverton appeared below him as he rounded a bend in the trail, the town nestled in a valley, surrounded by peaks. It was larger than he remembered from his last visit, 2 years ago, with more buildings and more activity. The silver boom had clearly been good for the settlement. As he descended the final slope into town, he began to see signs of the quarantine Dr. Thorne had mentioned in his journal. Yellow flags hung from several buildings, warning people to stay away. The streets were quieter than they should be for this time of day, with only a few bundled figures hurrying from place to place with their heads down, avoiding contact with others. The quarantine was still in effect, which meant the disease had not yet run its course. But if Tommy Bradshaw had delivered the medicine yesterday evening as promised, the antitoxin would already be working, already saving lives. Jericho made his way through town, following directions from a wary shopkeeper to find Dr. Thorne's clinic. He located it easily enough, a white building with green shutters, a neat sign out front identifying it as Silverton Medical Clinic. The building showed signs of heavy use, the porch worn smooth from countless feet, the door handle polished bright from many hands. He tied the donkey to the hitching post and climbed the steps, his heart beating faster with something he could not quite name. Anticipation, perhaps, or nervousness. He was about to meet people whose lives he had saved without ever knowing their names. Before he could knock, the door opened and a woman appeared. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that showed the exhaustion of someone who had been working without rest for days. She wore a simple dress with an apron over it, the apron stained with what might have been blood or medicine or both. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice professional but kind. "I'm looking for Mary Henderson." "I'm Mary." Her eyes studied him, taking in his weathered appearance, the signs of hard travel still visible despite his rest at Prospect Ridge. "Are you unwell? We're treating scarlet fever patients primarily, but if you have other medical needs..." "I'm Jericho Croft," he said. "I found Dr. Thorne's donkeys." Mary's hand went to her mouth, and her eyes suddenly filled with tears. "You're the one who sent the antitoxin? Tommy Bradshaw arrived with it yesterday evening. We've already begun administering it to the children." Her voice broke with emotion. "You saved them. Do you understand? You saved them." Jericho felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he could not quite name. "I just delivered what Dr. Thorne died trying to bring you. He's the one who saved them. I only finished what he started." Mary shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "Come inside, please. There's something you need to see." She led him into the clinic, which had been converted into a makeshift hospital ward. Beds lined both walls, each one occupied by a child or young person in various stages of illness. Some were still flushed with fever, their breathing labored. Others lay quiet, sleeping peacefully. But several, perhaps a third of the patients, showed clear signs of improvement, their color better, their breathing easier, their eyes open and alert. "These are the ones who received the antitoxin first," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "The most critical cases. We gave them the serum within hours of Tommy's arrival, and by this morning they were asking for food. Their fevers had broken. Their breathing had eased." She turned to look at Jericho, her expression fierce with gratitude. "Without that medicine, at least half of these children would be dead within a week. Because of you, they're going to live. They're going to grow up, have families of their own, live full lives." Jericho looked at the faces in the beds, seeing in each one a life that had been spared, a family that would not have to bury a child. He thought of his own son, and for the first time in 7 years, the memory brought something other than pain. It brought a sense that maybe, finally, he had managed to redeem some small portion of his loss by preventing others from experiencing the same tragedy. "I need to tell you about Dr. Thorne," he said quietly. "I found his journal. I know what he did, how he died. You deserve to know the whole story." Mary nodded, composing herself with visible effort. "Come to Aris's office. I'll make tea, and you can tell me everything." They sat in the small office at the back of the clinic, surrounded by medical texts and carefully labeled jars of medicine. Jericho recounted the entire story, finding the donkeys, reading the journal entries, making the decision to attempt the delivery, the brutal journey to Prospect Ridge, sending Tommy Bradshaw on with the medicine. When he finished, Mary sat in silence for a long moment, tears running down her face. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aris and I were engaged to be married," Mary said, her voice thick with grief but steady. "We had planned the wedding for this spring, after the worst of winter passed. He was the best man I ever knew, brilliant, compassionate, completely dedicated to his patients. When the scarlet fever outbreak started in November, he worked himself to exhaustion, trying to save everyone. 16-hour days, sometimes 20. He would collapse into bed at night and be up again before dawn, checking on patients, adjusting treatments, doing everything humanly possible to stop the disease from spreading." She paused, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "When we ran out of antitoxin, and he learned that a new shipment had arrived in Durango, I begged him not to go. I told him to wait for better weather, that a few more days wouldn't matter. But he knew they would matter. He knew that every day we delayed meant more children would die." She looked up at Jericho, her expression a mixture of grief and pride. "So he went anyway, and now he's gone, and I have to figure out how to live in a world without him." Jericho sat quietly, letting her talk, understanding that sometimes grief needed words to take shape, needed to be spoken aloud before it could begin to heal. "The terrible thing," Mary continued, "is that I'm angry at him. I know that's wrong. I know he died a hero, but part of me is so angry that he chose those children over a life with me, over our future together, over everything we had planned." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and then I feel guilty for being angry, because I know he made the right choice, the only choice he could have made given who he was, but it doesn't make it hurt any less. "He loved you," Jericho said gently. His last thoughts were of you, in the journal, his final words. He was trying to tell you something. The sentence was unfinished, but the intent was clear. He was thinking of you, even as he was dying. Mary nodded, unable to speak, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Jericho gave her time to compose herself, sitting in patient silence the way he had learned to do during 7 years alone on the mountain. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I don't know if I can run this clinic without him. I'm just a nurse, not a licensed physician. I learned everything I know from watching Aris work. But what if that's not enough? What if someone needs surgery? What if I miss something critical? What if I make a mistake that costs someone their life?" "You're already doing it," Jericho pointed out. "You've been managing the scarlet fever outbreak, administering the antitoxin, treating patients. You're doing everything Dr. Thorne would have done." "But I'm terrified," Mary admitted. "Every decision feels like it might be wrong. Every patient makes me question whether I know what I'm doing." Jericho understood her fear intimately. It was the same fear he had felt when he decided to attempt the journey through the storm. The fear that his actions might lead to disaster, that he might fail with terrible consequences. But he had learned something important during that brutal trek. "Fear of making mistakes is what keeps us careful," he said. "It's what makes us double-check our decisions and ask for help when we need it. But we can't let it paralyze us. Sometimes you have to act even when you're not certain, because the cost of not acting is worse than the risk of being wrong." Mary looked at him thoughtfully. "Is that what you told yourself when you decided to deliver the medicine?" "More or less. I knew I might die trying, but I also knew that children would definitely die if I did nothing. That made the choice simple, if not easy." They sat together in that small office for another hour, talking about Dr. Thorne and loss and the challenge of moving forward when the future you had planned was suddenly impossible. Jericho found himself opening up in ways he had not done in years, telling Mary about his own wife and son, about the fever that had taken them, about the 7 years he had spent hiding from the pain. "But something changed during this journey," he said. "I can't go back to being the man who lived alone on that mountain, content to trap animals and avoid human connection. I don't know what comes next, but I know it can't be the same as what came before." Mary studied him with eyes that seemed to see past his weathered exterior to something beneath. "You could stay in Silverton," she said quietly. "The clinic could use someone with your skills. You're good with animals, good in a crisis, good at solving problems, and—" She hesitated, then continued, "I could use a friend, someone who understands what it means to lose people you love." The offer tempted him, more than he wanted to admit, but 7 years of habits and patterns could not be undone in a few days. He was not ready to make that decision yet. "Let me think about it," he said. "I need to go back to my cabin, retrieve the other 2 donkeys, gather my things. After that, well, I'll see how I feel." Mary nodded, accepting his answer without pressure. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know something. What you did, bringing that medicine through the storm, was one of the bravest things I've ever witnessed. Aris would have been proud to know someone finished what he started. I'm proud to have met you." She stood on her toes and kissed his weathered cheek, then went back to her patients before he could respond. Jericho sat alone in the office for a moment, one hand touching the spot where her lips had pressed against his skin. Then he rose and walked through the clinic ward, looking at the recovering children, at the parents who sat beside their beds with relief and gratitude evident on their faces. This was what Dr. Thorne had died for. This was what Jericho had risked his life to preserve. These moments of hope and healing, these lives that would continue, these families that would remain whole. He left the clinic and stood on the porch, looking out at Silverton's snow-covered streets. The town was coming back to life now that the medicine had arrived. People moved with less fear, their steps lighter, their voices carrying hope instead of despair. Tommy Bradshaw appeared from around the corner, the young miner who had made the final delivery of the medicine. He looked exhausted, but profoundly satisfied, and when he saw Jericho, his face broke into a wide smile. "I did it," Tommy said, climbing the steps. "Ran most of the way, made it here in 14 hours. Miss Mary had the first doses administered within an hour of my arrival." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, for giving me the chance to help save those children. My sister Sarah, she died because we didn't have medicine like this available. But these kids, they're going to live. That means something. That makes Sarah's death feel a little less meaningless." Jericho understood exactly what he meant. His own son's death would never make sense, would never be anything but a tragedy, but maybe preventing other children from dying the same way could give that loss some small measure of meaning. He shook Tommy's hand and watched the young man head back toward Prospect Ridge, his step light despite his exhaustion. Then Jericho walked to the stable where he had housed the grey donkey, paid for another night's boarding, and found a room above the general store where he could rest. That night, he sat by the window and looked out at the mountains rising dark against the stars. His cabin was up there somewhere, waiting for him, his old life, his comfortable isolation, his carefully constructed refuge from pain. But he found he could not quite imagine returning to it permanently. Something fundamental had shifted during this journey. He had remembered what it felt like to matter, to be useful, to be part of something larger than his own survival. Mary's offer echoed in his mind. Stay in Silverton, help at the clinic, be part of a community instead of hiding from it. The thought terrified him. Opening himself to human connection again meant risking the kind of pain he had spent 7 years avoiding. It meant making himself vulnerable to loss, to disappointment, to all the ways people could hurt each other. But it also meant the possibility of something he had thought lost forever, a life with purpose and meaning, connections that made the days worthwhile, a reason to get up in the morning, beyond mere survival. Jericho did not make a decision that night, but he knew that when he returned to his cabin to retrieve the remaining donkeys and gather his belongings, it would not be with the intention of staying there. The mountain had given him 7 years of sanctuary, 7 years to grieve and heal. But healing was not the same as hiding, and the time for hiding had passed. Dr. Aris Thorne had shown him what courage looked like, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, to risk everything for something that mattered. The doctor had given his life for children he had dedicated himself to serving. That sacrifice deserved to be honored, not just with words, but with action. If Jericho stayed in Silverton, if he helped at the clinic, if he allowed himself to become part of the community, he would be continuing what Dr. Thorne had started. He would be choosing life over mere existence, connection over isolation, purpose over emptiness. It was a choice that required courage of a different kind than the physical bravery needed to cross a mountain in a blizzard. It required the emotional courage to open himself up again, to risk caring about people who might be taken from him, to invest in a future that offered no guarantees. But as Jericho sat by that window and looked at the stars, he felt something stirring in his chest that he had not felt in 7 years. Hope, not the desperate hope of someone clinging to impossible dreams, but the quiet, steady hope of someone beginning to believe that life might still hold possibilities worth pursuing. He would go back to his cabin one last time. He would gather his belongings, retrieve the 2 remaining donkeys, and close up the place that had been his refuge. And then he would return to Silverton and see what the future might hold. The winter of the White Death had tested him and found him capable of more than he had believed possible. Now it was time to see what else he might be capable of, what other challenges he might rise to meet, what kind of life he might build from the ashes of the old one. Dr. Thorne's journal lay in his pack, that final unfinished sentence haunting him. Tell Mary I love her. Tell her I am sorry I could not. Could not what? Come back? Marry her? Grow old with her? Jericho would never know how that sentence was meant to end, but he could help Mary carry on the doctor's work. He could be the friend she needed while she learned to live with her loss. He could ensure that Dr. Thorne's sacrifice continued to bear fruit through the lives he saved and the good he accomplished. It was not much, but it was something, and after 7 years of doing nothing that mattered, something felt like everything. Jericho spent 3 more days in Silverton, helping at the clinic and watching the children recover. Each day brought visible improvement as the antitoxin worked its way through their systems. Fevers broke and stayed down. Breathing became easier, the harsh rattle of congested lungs clearing to normal rhythm. Color returned to pale faces. Children who had lain listless and barely conscious began sitting up, asking for water, wanting to know when they could go home. Mary worked tirelessly alongside him, her competence and dedication evident in everything she did. She had trained under Dr. Thorne for 5 years, and while she might not have the formal education of a licensed physician, she possessed something equally valuable: practical experience, sound judgment, and a genuine compassion for her patients that informed every decision she made. Jericho found himself impressed by her strength. She was grieving the loss of the man she loved, facing an uncertain future, trying to run a medical practice without formal credentials, and carrying the weight of responsibility for dozens of patients whose lives depended on her skill. Yet she continued working, continued making difficult decisions, continued showing up every morning, ready to do whatever needed doing. On the 3rd evening, after the last patient had been checked and settled for the night, Mary invited him to join her for supper at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. They walked through Silverton's quiet streets, past buildings showing the warm glow of lamplight in windows, past families beginning to resume their normal lives now that the quarantine was being lifted. Over a meal of roasted chicken and winter vegetables, Mary told him more about Dr. Thorne, how he had come to Silverton 8 years ago, fresh from medical school in Philadelphia, how he had fallen in love with the mountains despite the hardships of frontier medicine, how he had proposed to her under a full moon last summer while they were returning from delivering a baby at a remote homestead. He used to say that medicine in places like this was 90% improvisation and 10% textbook knowledge. Mary said, a sad smile touching her lips. You couldn't always get the supplies you needed, couldn't always follow standard procedures. You had to make do with what you had and trust your instincts. She paused, her expression growing uncertain. I just don't know if my instincts are good enough. What if I miss something critical because I don't have his training? You won't, Jericho said with quiet certainty. You're too careful, too thorough, and you're not alone. There are other doctors in the territory you can consult with if you face something beyond your experience. You don't have to carry this burden entirely by yourself. That's what Aris used to tell me, Mary said softly, that medicine didn't have to be a solitary endeavor, that asking for help was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. She looked at Jericho with an expression he could not quite read. Have you decided what you're going to do? Are you going back to your cabin? Jericho had been wrestling with that question for 3 days, turning it over in his mind during quiet moments, testing different answers to see how they felt. The pull of his old life remained strong, the simplicity of solitude, the safety of isolation, the familiar comfort of routines he had perfected over 7 years. But there was a stronger pull now, something that had awakened during his journey through the storm and had been growing steadily since, a desire to be useful, a need to matter, a recognition that hiding from life was not the same as healing from loss. I'm going back to the cabin, he said slowly, working out his thoughts as he spoke, but only to gather my things and close it up properly. Then I'm coming back here, if the offer still stands. I'd like to help at the clinic, if you'll have me." Mary's face lit up with a smile that transformed her features, erasing the exhaustion and grief to reveal genuine joy. "The offer absolutely still stands. We need someone to manage supplies, handle deliveries, help with the physical labor of running a medical practice, someone strong enough to lift patients, practical enough to maintain equipment, reliable enough to be trusted with important tasks." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Someone. In other words, exactly like you." They discussed the practical details over the rest of the meal. Jericho would need a place to live. Mary knew of a small cabin behind the livery stable that its owner was willing to rent cheaply. He would need winter work clothes, new tools to replace what he had lost, and a rifle since he had sacrificed his Winchester on the climb to Prospect Ridge. The silver nuggets from the Prospect Ridge miners would cover those expenses with money left over. "How soon can you leave for your cabin?" Mary asked as they finished eating. "Tomorrow morning, weather permitting. The trails should be passable now. I'll take the grey donkey, retrieve the other 2 animals, pack up my belongings, and be back within a week." "Be careful," Mary said, her voice carrying genuine concern. "I know you're experienced in the mountains, but that storm was brutal. There might be unexpected dangers, weakened trees ready to fall, unstable snowpack, trails damaged by avalanche." Jericho appreciated her concern, even as he recognized that he had survived far worse during his journey to Prospect Ridge. "I'll be careful," he promised. "I've made it this far. I'm not about to get careless now." That night, Jericho lay in his rented room above the general store and thought about the journey ahead. Not just the physical journey back to his cabin, but the larger journey he was beginning. The journey back to living a full life, to being part of a community, to opening himself to the possibilities and risks that came with human connection. 7 years ago, he had fled to the mountain because the pain of loss had been too great to bear while surrounded by people who meant well but could not understand. He had needed that time alone, needed the silence and solitude to process his grief without the weight of other people's expectations and sympathy. But grief, he now understood, was not meant to be permanent. It was meant to be experienced, processed, and eventually integrated into who you became. The people you lost did not stop mattering when they died. They became part of you, informing your choices and values, giving meaning to your continued existence. His wife Sarah and his infant son had died, and nothing would ever make that okay. But he could honor their memory by preventing other families from experiencing the same loss. He could take the pain that had nearly destroyed him and transform it into something that helped others. That was what Dr. Thorne had done with his life, taken his knowledge and skills and dedicated them to reducing suffering, to saving lives that might otherwise be lost. The doctor had paid the ultimate price for that dedication, but his legacy would live on through the children he had saved, the families he had kept whole, the community he had served. Jericho could be part of that legacy now, not as a physician. He had neither the training nor the inclination for that, but as someone who supported the work, who made it possible for Mary to continue what Dr. Thorne had started. Morning came cold and clear, the sky a brilliant blue that promised fair weather for travel. Jericho gathered his minimal belongings, collected the grey donkey from the livery stable, and prepared for departure. Mary met him at the clinic to see him off, pressing a small package of food into his hands. "For the journey," she said, "and Jericho. Thank you for everything you've done, for finishing what Aris started, for agreeing to stay and help. It means more than I can properly express." He wanted to tell her that she did not need to thank him, that he was the one who should be grateful for the chance to do something meaningful with his life again. But the words felt too large and complicated for the moment, so he simply nodded and led the donkey out of town, heading north toward the mountains. The journey back was starkly different from his desperate rush to deliver the medicine. The weather was clear, the trails visible, the danger minimal. He made good time, reaching Widow's Canyon by afternoon and finding a safe place to camp for the night. The next morning, he continued up the mountain, retracing his path through terrain that looked almost peaceful under clear skies. He reached his cabin on the second afternoon and stood outside for a long moment, looking at the place that had been his entire world for 7 years. It looked smaller than he remembered, more isolated, more like a refuge for someone running away than a home for someone truly living. The 2 remaining donkeys stood patiently inside, having survived their time alone without difficulty. Jericho fed them, checked them for any signs of illness or injury, and found them healthy and sound. Dr. Thorne had owned good animals, sturdy and reliable, the kind that would serve well for years to come. He spent the next 3 days methodically preparing the cabin for a long absence. He dismantled his trap line, pulling 40 steel traps from their positions and storing them carefully inside. He stacked firewood along the walls, filled containers with preserved food, and secured the shutters against weather and animals. He packed his books in oilcloth, along with a few personal items: his mother's Bible, his father's pocket watch, a tintype photograph of Sarah holding their infant son. Everything else he left behind, trusting the cabin to keep it safe. This place would still be here if he ever needed it, still be available as a refuge if town life proved too much, but he did not expect to need it. He was moving forward now, not running away. On his final evening in the cabin, Jericho sat by the fire and read through Dr. Thorne's journal one last time. The early entries documented a dedicated physician going about his work, treating patients, managing the clinic, planning for the future with the woman he loved. The later entries showed a man confronting a crisis, making difficult decisions, ultimately choosing to risk everything to save children who depended on him. The final entry, those shaky words written by freezing hands, haunted him. "I will not make it. Too cold. Tying the animals together now. Someone must deliver this medicine. Someone must save them." Someone had. Jericho had found those animals, had read those words, had made the choice to finish what the doctor started, and in doing so, had saved not just the children in Silverton, but perhaps himself as well. He closed the journal and placed it carefully with his belongings. Mary would want it, would want to read Aris's thoughts one more time. It was a precious thing. That journal, a record of a good man's final days, a testament to what courage looked like when everything was on the line. The fire burned low, and Jericho banked it carefully, making sure the embers were safely contained. Then he lay down on his bed for the last time, his hands behind his head, looking up at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Tomorrow he would leave this place. Tomorrow he would lead 3 donkeys down the mountain toward a new life in Silverton. Tomorrow he would begin the work of building something meaningful from the ruins of his old existence. But tonight he allowed himself to remember, to honor the 7 years he had spent here, the healing that had happened in this small cabin, the slow recovery from a wound that had nearly killed him. This place had saved him when he needed saving. Now it was time to leave it behind and save himself in a different way, by choosing to live fully again, by opening himself to connection and purpose and all the messy, complicated, beautiful risks that came with being truly alive. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, Jericho Croft closed his eyes and slept, dreaming not of the past, but of possibilities still to come. Jericho woke before dawn, rose from his bed, and began the process of closing up his cabin for what might be the last time. He moved through the familiar space with deliberate care, making sure everything was secure and properly stored. The fire was cold ash now. He swept it clean, checked the chimney flue one final time, and closed the damper. His belongings fit into 3 canvas bags that he loaded onto the donkeys with practiced efficiency. The grey with the white blaze would carry his personal items and books. The 2 browns would carry his traps and tools. It was not much to show for 7 years of life, but it represented everything essential: the means to make a living, the objects that connected him to his past, and the knowledge he had gained through solitude. He took one last look around the cabin interior, committing it to memory. The bed where he had slept through countless storms, the workbench where he had maintained his equipment, the shelves where his provisions had sustained him through long winters, the chair by the fire where he had read his books and thought his thoughts, and slowly healed from wounds that had once seemed mortal. This place had been good to him. It had given him what he needed when he needed it. But that chapter of his life was ending, and it was time to write a new one. Jericho stepped outside and closed the door, then locked it with the heavy iron key. He hung the key on a nail under the eaves, where any future traveler who needed shelter could find it. Then he led the 3 donkeys down the trail, away from the cabin and toward whatever future awaited him in Silverton. The descent was easier than he expected. The weather held fair and cold, the trails were clear, and the donkeys moved with steady confidence. They seemed to understand they were going somewhere, that this was not just another day of checking trap lines, but a journey with purpose and destination. By mid-afternoon of the first day, Jericho reached Widow's Canyon. He crossed the creek at a shallow ford he had discovered years ago, avoiding the treacherous log bridge he had used during the storm. The 3 donkeys waded through the cold water without protest, their mountain breeding evident in their sure-footed progress. He made camp that night in the same shallow cave where he had sheltered during his desperate journey to Prospect Ridge. It felt different now, not a refuge from deadly cold, but simply a convenient stopping place. He built a small fire, cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon, and shared his food with the donkeys who stood nearby, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. As he sat by the fire, Jericho thought about what awaited him in Silverton. A job at the clinic, helping Mary continue the work Dr. Thorne had started. A place to live, a small cabin behind the livery stable, a chance to be part of a community again, to have daily interactions with people, to matter in ways that went beyond mere survival. The prospect both excited and terrified him. 7 years of solitude had made him unused to constant human contact, unused to the noise and complications that came with living among others. Would he be able to adapt? Would the quiet skills he had developed on the mountain translate to usefulness in town? But beneath the anxiety, he felt something stronger, a sense of rightness, of alignment between his actions and his values. He was choosing to move toward something rather than away from something. He was choosing to participate in life rather than observe it from a distance. He was choosing courage over comfort, and that choice felt true in a way nothing had felt true in 7 years. The fire burned low, and Jericho banked it carefully before settling down to sleep. Tomorrow he would reach Prospect Ridge, where he planned to stop briefly to thank Samuel and the other miners for their help. Then one more day of travel would bring him to Silverton, to Mary and the clinic and the beginning of his new life. He slept better than he had in weeks, his dreams peaceful for once, untroubled by memories of loss or fears of failure. When he woke the next morning, he felt rested and ready for the journey ahead. The trail to Prospect Ridge was clear now, the switchbacks that had nearly killed him during the storm, merely challenging rather than deadly. He climbed steadily, the 3 donkeys following, and reached the mining camp by early afternoon. Samuel and the others greeted him warmly, insisting he stay for a meal before continuing on. They wanted to hear about how the medicine had worked, about the children who had recovered, about Dr. Thorne's sacrifice and the good it had accomplished. Jericho told them everything, and they listened with the quiet satisfaction of men who had played a small but crucial role in saving lives. "You're heading to Silverton to stay?" Samuel asked, as Jericho prepared to leave. "That's the plan," Jericho confirmed. "Going to help at the clinic, see if I can be useful there." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Good man. The mountain will always be here if you need it. But a man's got to live among people sometimes, got to remember he's part of something larger than himself." He shook Jericho's hand firmly. "You did a brave thing, finishing what that doctor started. Now you're doing another brave thing, choosing to stay and help rather than running back to safety. That takes a different kind of courage, but courage all the same." Jericho led his 3 donkeys down from Prospect Ridge as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley below. Silverton was visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the town preparing for another cold night. But inside those buildings were warm fires and hot food, and people living their lives together, supporting each other through the hardships that frontier existence demanded. He was ready to be part of that again, ready to take his place in the community, to contribute what he could, to accept the risks that came with caring about people and places and outcomes beyond his own survival. The winter of the White Death had tested him and shown him what he was capable of. Now it was time to see what else he might become. Jericho reached Silverton as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and rose. The town looked different from when he had left it a week ago, more alive, more hopeful. The yellow quarantine flags had been removed from most buildings. People moved through the streets without the fear and caution that had marked their movements before. Children played in the snow, their laughter carrying on the cold evening air. He led the 3 donkeys through town toward the livery stable, drawing curious glances from residents who recognized him as the man who had brought the medicine that saved their children. Several people stopped to thank him, their gratitude evident in handshakes and tears and simple words that carried profound meaning. "My daughter Sarah is alive because of you," one woman said, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "She was burning up with fever, barely breathing. The doctor, Miss Mary, I mean, she gave her that medicine you brought, and within hours she was better. Within a day she was sitting up, asking for food. Thank you. Thank you for risking your life for children you didn't even know." Jericho accepted their thanks with quiet grace, redirecting the credit to Dr. Thorne whenever possible, but understanding that these people needed to express their gratitude, needed to put their relief and joy into words. He had given them back their children, their futures, their hope. That deserved acknowledgement. At the livery stable, he found the small cabin Mary had mentioned, a sturdy structure with a single room, a wood stove, and a comfortable-looking bed. The owner of the stable, a grizzled man named Henderson, no relation to Mary, he clarified, showed him around the space and quoted a monthly rent that was more than fair. "Heard what you did," Henderson said as they settled the terms. "Bringing that medicine through the storm. Lost my own boy to diphtheria 5 years back. Didn't have any medicine that could save him. What you did for these families." His voice broke, and he turned away, pretending to adjust something on the wall. "Just wanted you to know it matters. What you did matters." Jericho moved his belongings into the cabin, settled the 3 donkeys in the stable with generous portions of hay and grain, and then walked to the clinic as full darkness settled over the town. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and he could see Mary moving between beds, checking on patients, adjusting blankets, speaking quietly to worried parents. He knocked softly and entered. The ward was quieter than on his last visit, the desperate urgency replaced by calm recovery. Most of the children were sleeping peacefully, their breathing easy, their color good. A few were awake and sitting up, talking with their parents or reading books someone had brought for them. Mary looked up when she heard the door, and her face lit with genuine pleasure. She came to him quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes bright with emotion. "You came back," she said, and he could hear the relief in her voice, as if she had been afraid he might change his mind. "I said I would," Jericho replied simply. "Come see," Mary said, taking his hand and leading him through the ward. "Look at them. Every single one of the children who received the antitoxin is recovering. We didn't lose a single patient after you brought that medicine. Not one." She stopped at a bed where a girl of perhaps 7 lay sleeping, her small face peaceful, her breathing steady and strong. "This is Sarah Whitmore. She was the worst case we had. Fever of 105, struggling to breathe, barely responsive. We gave her the antitoxin within an hour of Tommy's arrival, and by the next morning, her fever had broken. By the following day, she was asking for her doll and wanting to know when she could go home. Mary's voice shook with emotion. She would have died without that medicine. They all would have died. At least a dozen children, maybe more. Jericho looked at the sleeping child and felt something shift in his chest, a sensation both painful and healing. His own son had died at 3 months old, too young for scarlet fever, but not too young for the other diseases that stalked children in an age before reliable medicine. He had been helpless then, able to do nothing but watch as his wife and child slipped away, despite his desperate prayers. But here, now, he had made a difference. He had saved children who might otherwise have died. He had prevented other families from experiencing the grief that had nearly destroyed him. That did not erase his loss, did not bring back Sarah and their infant son, but it gave their deaths some measure of meaning, transformed his pain into something that had helped others. "They're going home tomorrow," Mary said, as they moved through the ward. Most of them anyway. The last few will stay another day or two for observation, but they're all going to recover fully. She turned to face him, her expression serious. "You did this, Jericho. You and Dr. Thorne together. He gave his life trying to bring the medicine. You risked yours to finish what he started. Between you, you saved these children." They stood together in the quiet ward, surrounded by sleeping children and relieved parents, and Jericho felt a peace he had not known in 7 years. He had spent those years on the mountain, trying to escape his pain, trying to find some way to live with loss that seemed unbearable. But escape had not brought peace. It had only brought numbness, a slow erosion of everything that made life worth living. This feeling of having made a difference, of having prevented suffering, of having been useful in a way that mattered, this was what had been missing. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Not the safety of isolation, but the satisfaction of contribution. "When do you want me to start?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Mary said. "We need to reorganize the supply room, inventory what we have left after the outbreak, place orders for new medicine, and there's a homestead 20 miles north that requested a visit. A woman who's having a difficult pregnancy. I need someone to drive the wagon, carry supplies, help with whatever might be needed." She paused, then added softly, "I need a partner, Jericho. Someone I can trust, someone capable, someone who understands what this work means." "I'll be here," he promised. "Whatever you need." They stood together in the lamplight, two people scarred by loss, but choosing to move forward anyway, choosing to transform their pain into something that helped others. Outside, the winter night was cold and dark, but inside the clinic, surrounded by recovering children, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done, Jericho Croft felt warm for the first time in 7 years. He had carried medicine through a storm and saved lives he would never fully know, but in doing so, he had also saved himself, had found a way back to living, rather than merely surviving. Dr. Thorne's sacrifice had shown him the way. Mary's courage had given him the opportunity, and his own choice to open that cabin door, to risk everything, to finish what the doctor started, had made it all possible. The journey was not over. He would still face challenges, still struggle with loss and grief and the difficulty of opening himself to human connection again. But he was no longer alone in facing those challenges. He had found purpose, found community, found a reason to keep moving forward even when the path was difficult. The winter of the White Death had tested everyone it touched. Some, like Dr. Thorne, had given their lives. Others, like the children in this ward, had survived through the courage and sacrifice of strangers. And a few, like Jericho himself, had discovered that sometimes the deadliest storms led to unexpected redemptions, that sometimes the hardest journeys brought you exactly where you needed to be. He had opened his door to 3 freezing donkeys carrying medicine more precious than gold. In doing so, he had opened himself to possibilities he thought lost forever. Connection, purpose, hope, and the chance to make his remaining years count for something beyond mere survival. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Spring came slowly to the high country, as it always did. The snow melted grudgingly, revealing muddy ground and the first tentative shoots of new growth. The creeks ran high with snowmelt, and the meadows turned green almost overnight when the warm weather finally arrived. By late April, the mountains had transformed from white and grey to 1,000 shades of green and gold. Jericho Croft stood on the porch of the Silverton Medical Clinic, watching the sun rise over the eastern peaks. 6 months had passed since the winter of the White Death. 6 months since he had made the desperate journey that changed his life. The clinic's sign had been repainted, and now read, Silverton Medical Clinic, Mary Henderson, nurse practitioner, with, smaller letters below, Jericho Croft, assistant. The work had been harder than he expected, but more rewarding than he could have imagined. He had learned to manage medical supplies, to assist with basic treatments, to drive the wagon on house calls to remote homesteads. He had learned to calm frightened patients, to hold the hands of people in pain, to offer comfort when medicine alone was not enough. Most importantly, he had learned to be part of a community again, to let people into his life, to care about outcomes beyond his own survival. It was not always easy. Some days the clinic was overwhelming, filled with patients who needed more help than they could provide. Some nights he lay awake, worrying about people he had met that day, wondering if they would recover, if he had done enough to help. But those worries, that concern for others, they felt right in a way his isolated existence on the mountain never had. He was living again, truly living, not just marking time until death claimed him. Mary emerged from the clinic, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She had grown into her role as the town's primary medical provider, gaining confidence with each patient she treated successfully. The town council had officially recognized her as a nurse practitioner, acknowledging her years of training under Dr. Thorne and her proven competence during the scarlet fever outbreak. "Morning," she said, handing him one of the cups. "I was thinking we should ride out to the Morrison place today. Sarah Morrison is due any day now, and she was having some complications last week. I want to check on her, make sure everything is progressing normally." "I'll have the wagon ready within the hour," Jericho replied. These daily consultations had become comfortable routines, their partnership settled into an easy rhythm of shared responsibility and mutual respect. They stood together in companionable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the town come to life. A woman walked past, leading a little girl by the hand. Sarah Whitmore and her mother, the child who had been so sick during the outbreak. Sarah waved at them enthusiastically, her face bright with health and happiness. She would be 8 years old in July, would start school in the fall, would grow up to have her own children someday, all because medicine had arrived in time. "I've been thinking about Aris a lot lately," Mary said quietly, "about what he would think of how things have turned out. The clinic is thriving. The children he died trying to save are all healthy. The town has a functioning medical practice that serves everyone who needs it." She paused, her eyes distant. "I think he would be pleased. I think he would say we honored his sacrifice by continuing the work." "I know he would be pleased," Jericho said with certainty. "He loved you, and he loved this work. Seeing you carry it forward, seeing the lives you save, that's exactly the legacy he would have wanted." They finished their coffee and prepared for the day's work. Jericho hitched up the wagon while Mary gathered medical supplies. The Morrison homestead was a 3-hour drive into the mountains, but the roads were passable now that winter had released its grip. As they drove through the greening countryside, Jericho thought about the journey that had brought him here. 7 years of isolation on the mountain, convinced that safety lay in avoiding all risk of further loss. Then, one stormy night, 3 freezing donkeys at his door, and a choice that had changed everything. He thought about Dr. Aris Thorne, freezing to death in a blizzard, but using his last moments to send medicine forward, to give those children a chance at survival, even when he knew he would not share in their future. That kind of courage, the willingness to sacrifice yourself for people you might never meet, was rare and precious. But Jericho had learned that there were many kinds of courage. The courage to risk your life in a storm was dramatic and obvious, but the courage to open yourself to connection again after loss. The courage to care about people when caring meant risking future pain. The courage to show up every day and do difficult work without guarantee of success. That courage was just as real and just as necessary. The 3 donkeys that had carried the medicine, they were stabled at Henderson's livery now, well cared for and occasionally used for clinic business. Jericho visited them often, bringing them treats and checking their health. They were a living connection to Dr. Thorne, a reminder of the chain of events that had brought him to this new life. The cabin on the mountain still stood, weathering the seasons, waiting in case he ever needed it again. But he had not returned since that final departure 6 months ago, and he had no plans to do so. That chapter of his life was complete. The healing he had sought through isolation had ultimately come through connection, through choosing to participate in life rather than hide from it. As they reached the Morrison homestead, Mary gathered her medical bag and Jericho carried the extra supplies. Sarah Morrison was indeed in early labor, and Mary's examination suggested a normal delivery, but one that might benefit from experienced help. They stayed through the afternoon and into the evening, and just after sunset, Sarah Morrison delivered a healthy baby boy. Holding that newborn, seeing the joy on the parents' faces, feeling the weight of new life in his hands, Jericho felt his own son's memory not as a wound, but as a blessing. His child's brief life had mattered. His wife's love had mattered. Their loss had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. He had carried medicine through the winter of the White Death and saved children he would never fully know. But more than that, he had saved himself. He had found a way to transform grief into purpose, isolation into connection, survival into a life worth living. The journey from his mountain cabin to this moment had been measured in miles and hardships, in choices made despite fear, in small acts of courage that added up to a transformed existence. Dr. Thorne had shown him what sacrifice looked like. The 3 donkeys had given him the opportunity to act, and his own decision, to open that cabin door, to risk everything, to finish what a dying man had started, had made every